Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Frank Delporte. Based in Passchendaele, Belgium, Frank is a software developer with over 2 decades of experience in a number of different areas, including video and multimedia, technical project management, and web programming. You can follow him on Twitter at Frank Delporte and check out his website at webtechie.be. Frank is the author of the LeanPub book, Getting Started with Java on the Raspberry Pi. In the book, Frank teaches you the power and fun of combining programming and electronics using the popular Raspberry Pi technology. Along the way, he takes the reader through the history of the Java programming language, a set of really interesting interviews with experts, and he also aims to help you be a better programmer generally. In this interview, we're going to talk about Frank's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a self-published author. So thank you very much, Frank, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's really great to be here.
Thanks. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you first got interested in technology and computers and electronics.
And electronics, yeah. It way back when I was 10, 11 years old. I think we were one of the first schools in Belgium with computers, Commodore 64s. I'm that old, yes. So that's almost 40 years ago. And the fun thing with that Commodore 64, if you found the right books somewhere in a library or a little shop, you could get some PCBs to attach to your Commodore and control other stuff with the relay. And I didn't know anything about electronics. It's really through these books that I learned to do that. And when I was, I think, 14, 15 years old, I controlled my Lego train with my Commodore 64. So that was really the first time I was able to program something, but see the physical effect of it. So not just a program running on a computer, it did actually do something. And if a train with a small magnetic sensor was at a certain point, I could stop it. And so you had this interaction between very basic electronic components and a program and how these interact with each other. And then, yeah, as you said, I took the direction of video editing and did some multimedia development. It was a time that YouTube didn't exist yet, but there were CD-ROMs. So then we had the challenge to go from an analog video recording to a CD-ROM. So I have this whole conversion flow. Later came websites, and that's the moment I went back to programming, creating something. Yeah, CD-ROM that was Macromedia at the time, Flash Director, all bought by Adobe. So you had this whole evolution from static, simple websites. YouTube started, databases came into the picture for catalogs and stuff like that. So I went more and more back to this programming. And at a certain point, I joined the Belgian company Telefic, where we created passenger information systems, so screens in a train to show the next station. And that's actually where everything was combined. So we had video, we had communication with the wayside to bring information to the trains. And that's where I also started working with Java. These services on these trains and on the wayside were both using Java to control different things, announcements in the trains. And then I went to another company, Todi, where we made the robot mower, again with Java in the back end. So Java is since the last 10, 15 years, my main programming language. And aside from that, 10 years ago, I got involved with Code Dojo. I don't know if you know in Canada. It's also it's a computer club for kids between 6 and 18. As soon as they can read a bit, they can start programming with Scratch, a really great tool online for free. Again, you program something and you have a cat that starts moving. So for children, it's very attractive. And these Code Dojo clubs are organized by people who do this just as a hobby, and they bring their own interest into these clubs. So the clubs I was setting up in Belgium, we had some guys bringing Arduino and Raspberry Pis because they had that as a hobby. And if you compare that Commodore 64 from many years ago and now the Raspberry Pi, it's the same magic that happens. You can connect things to it. You can have a LED that blinks. If you spend 20 euros, you have an Arduino and a bunch of LEDs and buttons and resistors and relays, and you can make things that start moving or blinking or making sounds. And that's something really fascinating, that these very small devices, very inexpensive. You have a full-blown Raspberry Pi that is 1,000 times, I don't even know, more performant than my Commodore 64. It's way more, I think, Stephen. And the most expensive one is 95 euros. The cheapest one is 15. So that's a full computer. And it's 6 centimeters by something. So it's so small and so so powerful. And as a Java developer, I wanted to experiment with these boards. The idea was to build some kind of touchscreen device for the drum boot of my son with relays, so you could have lights going on and off and LED strips. But I didn't know anything about it, and that's the wonders of the internet these days. You can find everything, but still I got blocked. Java on a Raspberry Pi, not a lot of people are doing that. Some say it's even a bad idea. And I'm not going to argue with them. Java is just my programming language, and I wanted to do it. And I use Java. I use JavaFX to build a user interface. And eventually, instead of creating the project, I wrote a book. First, I wrote one article for the Magpie magazine. And then the publisher said, yeah, can this become a book? Then we had a long discussion about writing a physical book, a paper book. And the discussion was so long that I already started on something called LeanPub, which was also a discovery for me at that time. So yeah, I'm now a writer. And since June, just before the summer, I joined Azul, which is a company providing Java runtimes and services around Java and optimizing Java for your environment. And I'm now a technical writer for Azul. Improving the documentation. So yeah, you could say that the circle is round. I am a programmer. I was interested in writing. Now I'm a writer interested in programming. So I have those two loves that come together at my job and what I do on my blog.
Thanks very much for sharing that story. There's actually a lot to unpack there. One of the things I did preparing for this interview was I listened to a podcast interview you did with Airhacks, where you go into the host of that podcast is much more qualified to talk to you about the sort of technical details of what you did with that.
Really, Java guy. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and all the stuff you've done. But and I will put a link to that episode in the transcription of this, because it actually, you go into detail about the Commodore 64 story. In particular, I think one of the things I love to talk to people about on the podcast is kind of like their experience of technology evolving through time, and talking to people who started back in the day when you went to the store and like, oh, there's a book on something, I'll try that. It wasn't often that you had an idea for something and then you could just Google it and do it. Often you were kind of subject to what was available to you. Yeah. And you mentioned even now getting blocked, but in those days when you were 14, 15, using books or magazines to try and figure things out, if you got blocked, it was hard to get out of that block. There was no Stack Overflow or anything like that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what a little bit about that experience was like back when you were, a teenager trying to confront those kinds of issues.
That was really my problem. I think at that time you had Elector, which has published the paper version of my book, already existed. So they had this magazine about electronics. And I think I had one of those magazines with an advertisement for a book about programming with the Commodore 64 and interacting with electronic components. And it was a book in a bundle with that board, a PCB board with 8 relais, so that you could control 8 things, like my Lego train. And I live in Belgium. The publisher is from the Netherlands, so that's just over the border. But at that time, that was a challenge for my father to buy that book and send money to the Netherlands. That was already a challenge. And then the book arrived many weeks later with a letter that it says, yeah, here is the book and here is the PCB, but only the PCB. Sorry, we don't have one with all the components and which is assembled. And I never soldered anything. I didn't know what a resistor was, what a relay was. I just had a PCB and a list of components. So at that time, you had these electronic shops. We had one in Kortrijk, which is where I lived 5 kilometers. So with my bike, I had to go to the shop with my shopping list and ask this person in the shop, this is the first time I'm going to do this. Can you explain what I need? So I simply sent back home with a full bag of components, a soldering iron, and then it started. And after many days, when my PCB was soldered with all these components, and I plugged it for the first time in my Commodore 64, and I powered it on, I heard this electronic firework-like sound inside my Commodore 64. So I was really terrified that I fried my computer, and then checked again everything, plugged it in again, and it worked. So I was very lucky that I didn't ruin my computer. But imagine how this evolved in all these years. So paying something to another country or the other side of the world is one click away. Finding components, Google, in my case, DuckDuckGo, anything, and you have your components at unbelievable prices. When we started to go to dojo clubs, we wanted to have LEDs. We bought 100 LEDs for €1.50, and they were sent for free from China. What kind of world is it that we live in, that you can buy anything with a few clicks? It's amazing, but it's terrifying at the same time. But it opens so many possibilities. The experiments I wanted to do at that time would now take you half an hour, and a day later you have all the components in your mailbox. So it's a big evolution. On the other hand, it was a big adventure to get something done at that time. I don't know what is best.
Yeah, no. It's really interesting, because one natural thing to think is, well, actually, what you can do, you can get all the clicks, you can get all the searches, you can buy things from anywhere for cheap. One thing you probably can't do nowadays, like you could back then, there was just show up at a store and have someone talk to you for half an hour, who's an expert on the things in the store, and how they're used. That's pretty rare. But of course, the alternative is a million YouTube videos by someone who takes maybe hours to kind of go through a whole project and put a production together and show you every step.
Go to YouTube. And you'll find dozens of movies of how to solder something.
Exactly.
But indeed, that little shop, that electronic shop, it has existed at that same location until that person that had the shop retired. When I was the same age, you had the Tandy shops. I don't know if that was so existed in America. All these shops where they sold two types of computers, and that was it. So things evolved, and of course, speaking much more powerful devices. But
speaking of evolving, your next step, I think a lot of people would probably expect you went into university and did a computer programming degree or something, like a computer science degree, but actually you went to film school. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you were interested in film school and what kind of things you learned at film school at that time.
I've always been interested in technical stuff. How do things work? I was the kind of kid that opened every device which was broken. I know how a coffee machine works because I took some apart when I was a kid. And when I had to choose for a study, you go to a few schools. I went to Ghent, where they have a very beautiful school with engineering. But I also joined a classmate of me to Brussels, to a film school. And when we arrived there, that was in the middle of a park, a little castle. At that time, we didn't notice, but it was falling apart. But it looked a special, very special. And inside that castle, you had a television studio. What we didn't know, it was outdated by 20 years. Um, but yeah, it was a very fun environment. And you had three types of film school, two types, sorry. You had the artistic film school, where you become a director. And then you had the other school where we went, and that was a technical, it was an engineering school. The people who left that school were a cameraman, sound engineer, light engineer, editor. So we were really focusing on the technical part of making movies and television. Um, and that's that's how I decided to just go to that school because it was special and it combined a lot of challenging technologies. How do you make television? How do you make a movie? To be honest, if I now look back, I would advise myself to go to that engineering degree for electronics or software engineering. But yeah, it's always easy to look back. And when I left school, that was about the time when video editing for television moved from tapes to computer editing. So I was one of the first in Belgium to use a computer to edit video. So I had to travel around to different studios to demonstrate how this worked. At that time, it was a very big Apple with a very big case next to it with hard drives. And you could predict if I now click on this and this button for the fourth time, it will crash. So it were really new times. But that's how I went from video editing to making this a small file so it fits on a CD-ROM, and then even a bigger file that it fits on a website. And then you had DVDs were then also the thing that making a menu on a DVD that you could select a different part of a business presentation, not a movie, but a business presentation. So that's going to a film school was indeed a challenging option, also because there are a lot of candidates to become a television cameraman or video editor, but there's not a lot of people who eventually get hired. So I was lucky to get into this position.
And eventually you made your way into web development as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what led to that happening.
Just out of curiosity and opportunities and luck and how do you call it? At that time, I was technical chief or whatever you call it for a television channel where we did in the weekends broadcasting of sport matches. And my responsibility was to keep this system alive and have all these live feeds coming in. But that actually meant that I had 1 hour of work to start and put everything in place. And at the end, disconnect a few cables, clean up. So I had 11 hours in between that I had to be there, but didn't have a lot of work. So I bought my very first laptop and a book about how you create an HTML page. And Dreamweaver was on there, I think. It was even front page at that time, Microsoft front page. A hell of a program. It created a lot of boilerplate that you didn't need, but had to find out why it was there. And that's how I created my first websites and then found some customers for that, a few friends who wanted a website. And then that became my main job to develop websites. Very basic at that time. It was the time of the annoying skip intros. You remember? The flash animations where you had to sit through if they forgot to put a skip intro button. So you had these whole animations with music and nice in the beginning, annoying after a few times. Even those flash animations, that was many years ago.
Yeah, that was actually a really interesting moment to kind of think about. I mean, like people were figuring out what's the web, what should the experience, what sort of should the experience of sitting in front of a screen and watching stuff and be. And a lot of people I mean, the initial stuff was reading, right? And then came looking at pictures. But when the big media companies started getting websites and stuff like that, they wanted to make basically movies or what have you.
Hmm.
You know, when you go to the website, I'm going to see a little movie, because that's what they did. And in their view, you were kind of like, it was like a version of watching television to some extent.
Hmm.
And they wanted to sort of give you a kind of experience, as you said, when you couldn't, if you didn't have skip intro buttons, then you were just stuck watching
Yeah.
it, when that might not be what you want to do at all. But
Hmm.
the idea of
Hmm.
having a captive audience that doesn't have a choice about what you show it was kind of the idea
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in many cases.
You
Um,
had this intro movie before you could enter a website. Yes.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and it's actually, it was really interesting that you mentioned, Dreamweaver and stuff like that. That brings back memories of, sort of how hard web development seemed,
Yeah.
sometimes at the time. And it was like, these big, I mean, we can talk about technical writing and documentation and stuff like that, but, things came with big, huge manuals. The idea of intuitive UI wasn't really a thing. People almost expected things to be really hard and complex.
Hmm.
Otherwise, they'd be kind of disappointed that, they paid so much for it.
Hmm. But actually, at that time, Adobe really pushed some evolutions in there. So Dreamweaver was really a good tool from the very first time I used it, and coming from
Oh,
front page, I think that was really and then I was also experimenting with databases. So I had some customers who wanted to show natural tiles, natural stone tiles,
mm,
a whole collection of those. And another one was a light fixture company. So they wanted a database behind it. And Dreamweaver really made that very easy to understand how you would need to interact with the database. Yeah, skip intro, that were Flash animations. I was really a lover of Flash, not only for this skip intro stuff, but also for business presentations. You could build really amazing, beautiful stuff with it. It evolved into Plex and action scripts. If I compare ActionScript and the ease of development with ActionScript, that same experience you have with Java and JavaFX. So they were really in front of current things. What nowadays JavaFX can do for graphical designs actually already existed with Flash. You could build amazing things. It was the same application could be executed on different platforms and on the web until Steve Jobs one day said, I will never put Flash on an iPad. That was the beginning of the end for that technology. But yeah, Adobe evolved into more other directions, and the licenses became a lot more expensive. Um, but if you now look into how software development and tools evolved into both very great tools you can buy, but on the other hand, this open source community and what you can find for free. I was just messing around with the picture. I want extra solar panels on my roof because they say that electricity is too expensive. So I want to draw on my roof some extra solar panels. There is a Photoshop online. Someone made a clone of Photoshop which works in the browser. It's free. It works exactly the same as Photoshop. How well can you make something? It's incredible, and there's an amazing community doing open source stuff, and that's also one of the things that I find so amazing about Java. When I started writing my book, you mentioned in the intro, I have some interviews. These interviews, these are the Java experts. These are my heroes, and I send them a tweet, and they reply. They say, "Oh yeah, of course, no problem. What do you want to know?" Yeah,
yeah.
it keeps amazing. Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting. You're touching on something really interesting there, I think, which is that, creativity and community go hand in hand.
Mhm.
with technology in very interesting ways, sort of coding clubs, like you mentioned, of course, like electronics clubs and stuff like that, can often be very popular. And then when the sort of web came around and people could interact with each other, in chat rooms or whatever, but then eventually in sort of more sophisticated ways, they could actually do in addition to producing content, like videos and how-tos and stuff like that, and just sharing advice, they could, build programs together, which is just amazing. And then you can, when you add open source to that, then that this sort of self-reproducing feedback loop of productivity and creativity sort of emerges. And that just leads me to ask, when did you get into, blogging and creating things for other people?
Um, I always love to write. How- in an early job, when I was doing website development, we created a website targeting pregnant women or pregnant couples, to give them tips and da da da. And we were also pregnant at the time, so I started writing about that story. It was a problem, pregnancy, so we were a lot in hospital. So I started writing for my clients. I started blogging. Um, so that became my first experience of writing my diary, but then in public. A few years later, we went to Kazakhstan because our son is adopted. So again, that became a story that colleagues and family was interested in. Again, started writing about that. And since then, blogging has been a constant, but with a long set of pauses in between. Whenever something was in my mind, whenever I learned something that I thought maybe this could be interesting for someone, that's also when I created my own blog. Yeah, I put it online. I have no clue what is the oldest article on my blog, actually, so I have to look it up for you now. So it goes back to 2007. Wow. And I
Wow.
see it's two articles about ActionScript and Flex. So apparently I had an issue. I didn't find a solution. And when I found my solution, I wrote it into these blogs. So those were my first technical blogs. Then in between, when I started Code Dojo, I started Club 7 and 8, I think, in Belgium. Now we have over 100. Again, I described what do you need to do to start a Code Dojo club. You have to find a sponsor, a location, then some documentation about starting to program with Scratch and STEM. And yeah, and so slowly it became, yeah, a bit of my playground. When I do an experiment with electronics of programming something new, I keep also a text file open, and every link which leads me to, I think, a solution or part of the solution, I keep it. Most of the time, the first 10 links I have to remove again because they were the wrong directions. But at the end, I have very short notes and a few links of what I used to create this thing. And whenever I have some time left, I really like to make that a story again. Um, and that's also the same thing which happened with eventually led to the book. So I wanted to create this touchscreen controller for my son. First problem was, how do I run Java FX, graphical user interface library? How do I run that on a Raspberry Pi? I didn't find a lot of tutorials around that topic. And then, it was a long time that I was using LEDs and then resistors and all this kind of stuff. How do you control that with Java from a Raspberry Pi? What even is this Raspberry Pi and what is this pin and why is there 3.3 volt coming out of it and 5 volt from another? So all these things I had to find out. And I just kept a big list of notes.
That's great. You've done a lot of my own podcast host work for me there by segueing into the next part of the interview where we talk about your book. But it's a very important point though, that a lot of the the sort of origin stories of projects are like you had a problem yourself or you were learning something yourself. And then when you're done, you're like, you write the thing that you wish you'd had when you'd started. And
Actually, that is the tip for everyone who thinks, should I blog? Yes, everyone who is a programmer or any other kind of hobby or project or whatever that you're doing, and you're finding a solution that you didn't read somewhere else, it means that you found something new that someone else also can use. Maybe two persons, maybe more. You never know. But
yeah, it's interesting. It's also a bit of a it sort of goes all the way from the kind of cheesy life hack to the like, best practice at big corporations. But like it's a boring word, but documentation is an incredibly powerful thing. And so that thing that you mentioned of having a text file open, I mean, there's a few things that I wish I could go back and tell my younger self, do this, and one of them would be like, when you figure something out or do some process for the first time, write it down, whatever it is, it's like, well, how, if I want to, I mean, in the old days, this used to be harder, but like, let's say I want to change my address when I move. Well, what are all the places I have to get in touch with? And nowadays what you do is I use spreadsheets for this kind of stuff often too. And it's like, when I move, list all the things, links to all the change address things, links to all the phone numbers if you need to call, stuff like that. And but scale that up to like, let's say you're working at a company and like, people come and go from companies. If you come up with a new process or you do something for the first time, write it down, have a corporate wiki or whatever. But like it sounds small, but these kinds of things can have huge consequences for productivity, maintaining products, explaining them to people and things like that. And are these sort of, ways that lots of books got started. And so on that note, specifically with respect to your book, I was wondering if you could start with answering the question you just asked a moment ago. What is Raspberry Pi?
Raspberry Pi, a very small computer. That's the basic idea. So how the Raspberry Pi is a company, a foundation in England. How their origin is, can we build a computer for everyone so that everyone is able to get a computer in the house, even if you don't have any money or just a little bit, can we provide you a computer? So the very first Raspberry Pi, the idea was the connector was not a computer screen connector. It was really an analog signal that you can connect to a TV, the old CRT TVs. So that if you could only afford this little board, you could get started because you could connect it to your TV. So you didn't need a computer monitor. So I think that the starting price then was 35 euros. So it's a board of 10 centimeters by 6, something like that, I think. That was the very first one. We are now on the Raspberry Pi 4. The most expensive one is now 95, but it is a full Linux computer. So if you get Raspberry Pi operating system, it looks like Windows, Mac, Ubuntu desktop. It looks very similar. So if you can work with any other computer, you have a text editor, you have a web browser. Of course, it's not that fast as your $700 laptop. You still need a keyboard, a mouse, a screen. It's only this little PCB. And one of the funny parts of this Raspberry Pi is in the beginning, they had this processor that they selected, and this chip had some extra pins that you could connect electronic components. And they were not going to do anything with it. But then, during the design, they found out, we have some place on the board. Let's put some pins. I think there were only 20 something of these pins. We'll see what happens with it, what people can do. And eventually, I think this has been one of the critical things, of the most important things, why this Raspberry Pi became so popular, is you can connect whatever device you want. I have here a Crow Pi. It looks like a laptop, You can take out the keyboard, and under the keyboard, you have a distance sensor, a motion sensor, a LED screen, an LCD display, 20-something buttons, a temperature sensor. All these components are all connected to this Raspberry Pi. So without the need to wire anything, you can read the temperature in your room. You can detect that someone is moving with his hands above it. So it's not just a computer, it's an interface. You can connect stuff to it. And then Raspberry Pi evolved. They also have the Raspberry Pi 400, which is this Raspberry Pi 4 inside the keyboard. So you have a keyboard, there's a Raspberry Pi inside. It looks like a Commodore 64, which has been on a diet. It's a bit thinner. But again, you connect a mouse, you connect a screen, and that's your computer. Also costs 100 euros, something like that. Now they have, for people who know Arduino, Raspberry Pi also created a Raspberry Pi Pico, which is also a microcontroller, costs $4. It's an amazing device. It's so powerful. You can connect LED strips to it. You can connect Wi-Fi. They have now the Pico V, which has Wi-Fi on board, $6. So these prices are so low. If you want to start experimenting with electronics, with programming on these kind of devices, just leave your PC on the side. Don't blow it up. Don't connect dangerous devices to it. Use one of these cheaper things. And yet the idea is bring affordable computing to anyone in the world. It's a bit what the BBC has done in England with the microbit. It was one of the very first, very affordable microcontrollers and computers that they brought to schools. Everyone at a certain age got one for free. Raspberry Pi is a bit related to that. It's also founded in England. One problem we have at this moment is a chip shortage around the world, and that also affects Raspberry Pi. If you now want a Raspberry Pi, good luck. There are sites who monitor all the other sites who are selling Raspberry Pis, and you are alerted that they are in stock. And if you're lucky, you can buy one. So
well, that's fascinating. I hadn't heard that it had affected Raspberry Pis. I mean, I'd heard about cars and laundry machines and everything else. But there you go. It's one thing I didn't want to like pass over without actually getting into a true detail. Is you mentioned pins, and so for people listening who might be like they've maybe never seen, I think it's called a breadboard or something like that. For people who are completely unaware of electronics, basically you've got a little connection, a physical connection that you make, and you can control whether or not there's basically electricity going through that specific connection. So
you have this small PCB, and on one side you have 2 rows of 20 metal pins, 1 centimeter high, something like that. So you don't even need a breadboard. You have a small cable, you plug it in. On the other side, you have a LED. And then from the LED, you go back to your ground. There has to be a resistor in between. But
what's a LED?
A LED, a light emitting diode.
So an LED. Okay, so
LED. A very small component. And if you send electricity through it in the right direction, it sends out light. Now, these pins, more than 20 of these 40 pins, you can control from software. And either there is 0 volt coming out of them, and if you put it on one, then it becomes 3.3 volts. So it's a digital pin. It's on or off. It's a 0 or a 1. So that means if you control it from software and you put 3V3 on it, then your LED will go on. Or the other way around, if you put 3V3 on it through a button, for instance, you can read it. Is there voltage on this pin or not? Very simple with a LED and a button, it's on or it's off. Now, if you do this very, very fast, then it becomes a communication way. So you can talk to another chip or another device, like for instance, a distance sensor. We really like to use a distance sensor in electronics to do as a first example. These distance sensors, have a few pins, and on one pin you have to put for a short time a voltage to say, I want you to measure the distance between the sensor and something above it. And then it will send back how long. So it's like a bat, a flying bat. So they measure the distance with an ultrasound. So if it reflects, they know how far they are from a wall. It's the same thing. The sensor will send back for the same time that it's doing this measurement, how far an object is. So you have to read how long is this 3 volt 3 enabled or not. And then you can calculate how far this distance is from the sensor. This is a very low value. So you have to be very fast with your program. That's why it's a nice challenge. You have to do a very strict timing of how you measure values. Otherwise, you get values which are out of range or cannot be right. So yeah, these pins, it's playing with voltages. And for people who have been using Arduino or other microcontrollers, you have analog pins and digital pins in that world. A digital pin is 1 or 0. An analog pin is between 0 and 255. So it can be, you can have a range of values. The Raspberry Pi is simple, just digital, 1 or 0. So it's not ideal for some electronic components, while an Arduino is better. But it's always a trade-off. What do I want to achieve with my project? What do I want to do? Of course, there's a solution. You can do the same thing with Raspberry Pi with another chip in between. But yeah, and then you have to start experimenting.
Exactly. And it was exactly that ability to kind of control things that sort of surprised the people who developed the first Raspberry Pi, as I understand this story, because I mean, it just sort of, you actually mentioned this at the beginning. I think I read something you wrote about it. Maybe I forget on Twitter or something, but, so this is back when they first came out, but your son plays the drums. I used to play the drums myself, so I could identify with the story because drums are really loud. And so you built a sort of box or something for your son to play drums in. But what you wanted to do was set up a light so that like he knows when dinner's ready or something like that, right? And so like people just started doing really fun things like that. Yeah, people started doing really fun things like that. You know, they realized, and I think probably what attracted people too was that by having that sort of on off, like 1 or 0 kind of control, you get a really kind of direct understanding of the beginnings of information theory and things like that, right? Like, what can I communicate with on and off states between two things, you know, when I can transmit it or receive it. And it just gets you to the heart of computing in a very tactile way.
And reading a button is very simple. A button is pushed or is not pushed. But then going further, how can I read is something halfway. If you want to dim lights, how do I read this value? In the drum boots of my son, it's very simple. I have a Raspberry Pi. On top, there are 2 boards plugged onto the Raspberry Pi, onto these pins. And then I have 8 relays. So each relay is, so the Raspberry Pi only can supply 3 volt 3, but my lights, one is 220 volts, the other one is 15. So I have different stroboscope and LED light. And so all these are connected to this relay, which is a button, you could say, for toggling this higher power, but my Raspberry Pi can control it. And then we have a few LED strips, and those are better controlled with an Arduino. So the Raspberry Pi is sending a signal to the Arduino. Now you have to send this pattern to the LED strip. So it's a bit combination of different components. And as you said, because I use Java on this Raspberry Pi, Java has 1 million libraries available for every purpose that you can think of, and one of them is a web server. So with a few lines of code, you add a web server to this application, and now from anywhere in the house, I can tell this application, put all the LEDs on red, let them blink, so my son knows he has to stop playing the drums and come down, and dinner is on the table. because, as you say, drumming can be pretty loud. And he drums upstairs, so we don't have to go up the stairs all the time to tell him to stop drumming. Yeah, it's that was one of my main choices for Java. All the libraries, as I said before, it's most of them are open source, so you can extend your application with a ton of possibilities, and you actually only need a few lines of code.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. That's something that you go into in a chapter in the book, as well as the history
Mhm.
of Java, the programming language, and why you chose it as the kind of like language you wanted to use for some of your experimentations, and how useful it can be in so many ways. And of course, it's your day job as well. Um, just in the interest of time, moving on to the last part of the interview. So normally what we would do is we would talk about, your book and your writing process and stuff. But we've actually kind of talked. You told that story already at the beginning, and it is really interesting. I think that just to make that connection, that the company that you bought that very first book from is the company that published the paper version of your book. And I just wanted to make
They
sure
are the
people
trigger. Yes, yes,
people got that. The Elector, it's Elektor,
yeah,
and that's just a
yeah,
really
indeed.
great sort of closing of the loop. But since we've already talked about that, the last thing I actually wanted to talk to you about is one fun thing you did in your book is you have these interviews with these experts, but you occasionally have just some thoughts of your own on something, which is a really great device for kind of giving people a bit of a refresh. Kind of, between chapters. And in one thing you talk about social media, and so this is a big, right turn in the interview. But just before we go, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because it's I mean an interesting story that you tell about your experience and the decision that you made, and why.
Well, as I said, I'm a big fan of technology and how things evolve and what is new. And at a certain point, whatever new service I saw passing, I registered. Everyone who wanted my details, you get them. And I went to a conference in Belgium with Aral. Aral Balkan was a speaker, and Aral Balkan is one of those programmers who was a hero in Flash. He made amazing Flash animation games, stuff like that. So I went to this conference. He was a speaker, and he spoke about the dangers of social media instead of Flash. And he's now really a social media critic. He even founded a company to build something which is you own your own data. That's the main story. Eh? And that was really an eye opener, because if something is for free, then you are the product being sold. Facebook is free because they sell your data. Google is free because they know everything about you and can target you with advertisements. I wasn't aware of that before. I didn't think about that. And at that time, yeah, it clicked, and I just started. I haven't used Gmail and Google since then. I mentioned DuckDuckGo before. That's my search engine. I still have my Gmail address, but it forwards to my own address. I don't think I get any email anymore on that one. Yeah. On the other hand, I'm addicted to Twitter. Everything I learn, well, a lot of what I learn is from Twitter. But I'm well aware that I'm also a product being sold there. Um, my son, he's 12, is the age of TikTok, Snapchat, whatever. um, we should be more aware of what is happening behind the curtains of these companies, I think. But it's difficult. It's a balance. We have Mastodon, which is a great alternative to Twitter, which is again open source, managed by the community. But there are not that many people on there, and I don't find the content that I get from Twitter. So I'm still more on Twitter than on Mastodon. Yeah, it's a difficult discussion, and I find it hard to tell this story to people who, yeah, most people just don't care. They like Facebook, they like getting free stuff, and yeah, I understand also.
Yeah, it's yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, it's I've had this discussion with a few people on the podcast in the past. I mean, and it is interesting how like what it's just sort of banal observation, but what seems really great can turn bad. And so, for example, one guest we had a while ago, he achieved a kind of Twitter fame that became addictive. And he
Mm-hmm.
just he would watch how many likes did he retweets did he get on every tweet and go back to it, back to it, back to it, and think about the next one and the next one and the next one. And so that was the form of toxicity that he encountered. Of course, for other people, it's
Mm-hmm.
getting attacked, and then but adding on to that, that you're a kind of product being managed all the
Yeah.
time, and it's just it is something that unfortunately it's when we say some people just don't want to think about it there because it's partly because there really is so much to think about that you just kind of like whatever. I use it for fun, and that's all I'm going to think
Mm-hmm.
about. For me, for Twitter specifically, I learn a lot from Twitter as well. I mean, the people I follow are, there's an old joke that I think I've mentioned here probably too many times, but that Facebook is who you went to high school with, and Twitter is who you wish you went to high school with. And so on Twitter, I mostly follow, like journalists and like rock stars and stuff like that. And so it's like, the guy from Twisted Sister, it's great on Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
and and actually watching journalists go back and forth on Twitter. I really like that too, because they'll have, and historians, there's historian Twitter, there's journalist Twitter, there's literary Twitter. There's all kinds of things like that. So you can carve out good niches for yourself, but you can never really get away from the fact that they are, using you. You are a product. I mean, it's particularly hard to not think about how your attention is being managed when you use
Mm-hmm.
Facebook, I find.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but anyway, thanks very much for sharing that. That was really great. And then the whole story, that was really awesome too. The last question I always like to ask of people on the podcast, if they're a Lean Pub author, is if there was one magic feature we could build for you, or one terribly awful thing about Lean Pub that had you shaking your fist at the screen all the time that we could fix for you, is there anything that you can think of that you would ask us to do?
Let me first thank you for how LeanPub works. Being a programmer and being able to write a book in a Markdown file, commit it to GitHub, and get the PDF with the finished book a few minutes later, it's wow. um, I had to buy, uh, I became a paying customer at the time that I was really writing the 6 months because I just loved to check the changes to see how this book really grew, where an image was of a page and was on the second page where it shouldn't be, and so I had to add a line break somewhere. So, um, an amazing thing that you built.
Oh, well,
I
thank you
can
very much.
remember when I was writing that I was struggling with the formatting a few times. But then you had this free book where you had all these the explanation of the specific markdown of the language that you're using. Um, I don't know, the page break, is that something new that you added? I rediscovered it just recently. That you
Uh,
can actually put a page break. That was something I was missing, I think, when I was writing the book. That's 2 years ago. Now, I started a few months ago with updating the ebook to a 2022 version. And I discovered that I can now add a page break. So that was something I was going to complain about, but that's solved. um, yeah, and I now have the ebook at Leanpub, and I have the paper book with the lector. Um, it's not the kind of book that they sell thousands. So they made one print. That's probably the only one they will create. But that means that that print from 2 years ago is from 2 years ago. While the Leanpub book, yeah, you can just update it and there's a new version, everyone is alerted. Um, being able to have, I'm still also a lover of paper books, so I can imagine that people would love to buy the ebook and maybe also a paper version. And maybe something else. I bought this book of Bruno Loaci, entrepreneur on Leanpub. And yeah, I was a bit, so I only paid the minimum amount. I was afterwards thinking, yeah, maybe I should have paid more. And going back to the thing that I bought and pay something extra, I don't know if that's something which could be added or which is a good idea. I have no clue.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing all that. Yeah, no, that is interesting. I mean, when it comes to the feature of page break, I mean, in my head, it's new, but that could mean it's been around for a couple of years. It's one of those things that you kind of can't. I don't remember the date, but it does feel new. But we've been doing this for a long time. That was definitely a popular thing to add. So people can manage, particularly where images show up on the PDF version and stuff like that. When it comes to print, we do have our print ready PDF output, so which people use to publish on print on demand services. How easy it is to update, like it's easy to update the LeanPub produced print ready PDF. You click a button, and you get your PDF. But when it comes to actually uploading it onto a print on demand service, whether it's Amazon like KDP or Ingram or something like that, that how easy it is to update and have that sort of propagate through their system. It depends on the third party system that you're using, but that is kind of updates are doable when you're using systems or services like that. And when it comes to the last thing you asked, actually, that's something that's been a long standing kind of request that we get from people, which is basically a tip jar or something like that. Is there any way I can just tip an author? And what we always say is buy the book again. Which is and then you can archive the second copy in your LeanPub library or what have you. But that is something that we've been asked for, and we do sort of I'm not going to say plan. We do intend to do something along those lines at some point. But that's definitely something people ask for, and it's actually something that that's kind of deep LeanPub there, and lessons that we learned, right, is like people wanting to pay, feeling bad that they didn't pay more for something. You don't learn that in kind of MBA school. That's not something you'll hear in Economics 101, but it's very true. And it's particularly true in the self-publishing world, and in a self-publishing world where people make 80% royalties, like just to boost LeanPub a little bit. We show how much the author earns when you make a purchase. And that really helps establish a connection between the reader and the author.
And also a big thank you for the pricing model. As you say, the 80%. I had published my ebook also on Amazon KDP. I stopped it for two reasons: the low part that you get yourself as a publisher, and that they send you money from all over the world, and my accountant really hates it. You as LeanPub pay from one account, one address. That's clear. Amazon paying from all over the world, from all different valutas, is that called correctly in English?
What was that word?
Get valuta, so you get yen, and you get French, you get euros,
different currencies.
Dollars, currencies. Yeah, that was the word I was looking for. Sorry. Yes, you get all these different currencies, and then how much they recalculate it. Accountants hate it, and luckily in Belgium you have to be in order, so it has to go to my accountant. So I just stopped Amazon. I was sick of it. I had enough. I don't know how much I really made on Amazon, but please go to LeanPub, buy there.
Well, on that note, thanks. That's a great place to end. But anyway, but thanks again very much for being on the podcast and for being a LeanPub author. And for anybody interested in this very interesting book, it's called Getting Started with Java on the Raspberry Pi.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a LeanPub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.